So joining us now on the Practical 365 podcast is Microsoft MVP Tom Morgan. Hi Tom, and welcome to the show.
Hello, thanks for having me. Excited to be here.
It is a pleasure. It's been a long time since we've seen each other. Was it? It was either Ignite or it was one of those Teams days that we did down in London. How's life been?
Yeah, good. Thank you. It's been busy. Lots have been happening, but yeah, no, it's been very good. Good. Thank you.
So you're coming on the show today because you've written a book, and I was gripped from the extract that you put online. So I'm going to be reading this myself on the Kindle as I go on holiday today. But I wanted to get you on the show to really talk to some of the other people that really need to read about some of this stuff, because Microsoft do say everybody should be a developer. While that might not necessarily be 100% true, there's definitely a lot of room for people, especially IT pros who do Microsoft 365, where they don't have a lot of choice now, but to learn about the Graph API and get involved in a little bit of development. So I was wondering if you tell us a little bit about your book and who should read it and who's it aimed at.
Yeah. So the book kind of came out of what I saw and normally I'm the only dev person at an IT Pro conference. Like that's been the standard for quite a long time. But in the last couple of years, it's been more and more obvious that more and more people are showing up, not from development and not from IT Pro, but just real people, end users, service owners, smart people inside the business who want to solve the problem. And Microsoft will be meeting them with things like Power Platform and saying, you can do this. And there's lots of excitement about what's possible, and there's lots of examples of people doing things and improving their productivity, but also there's a fair bit of confusion as well, because there's lots of people who want to do it but don't really know where to go. I think there's lots of people on the pro side of the fence who are a bit unsure about what it all means for if they want to get into doing Teams development. Should they go the kind of standard route, if you like, of the route I suppose I went in from coming from a general kind of developer background into doing sort of specifics around Skype for Business and then Microsoft Teams, or should they go to this sort of no-code place? And also, if you're like an IT manager, if you're trying to make decisions about your organization, it can be really hard to know what to do, because are you supposed to be locking these people down because entire sections of your organization that don't fall under your development team are out building apps that the business is becoming reliant on? Is that a good thing or a bad thing? What should you do about it? Should you embrace it? Should you run from it? How do you train those people? So many different things. So I was trying to address all of that in one place to kind of give an overview of the entire development landscape, not just from pro, not just from non-pro and low code, but all of it, which is kind of, it's resulted in sort of a couple of different books rolled up into one, which has the potential to be a bit confusing, but it was so important for me that each different camp understood what the other was doing as well, because you can't do these things in silos.
I really like the idea of you trying to break down the silos between the two, because there historically has been sort of this enforced division between somebody who's an IT pro and administers things and somebody who's a developer and develops things. But I'm wondering, what do you think the 2 or 3 most key things about Teams dev that IT pros need to know? I mean, should I just tell them shut up and read Tom's book? I mean, could you give us a summary?
Yeah, no, I think first of all, even knowing what's possible, I think is a really good place to start, because there are, even just looking at the pro side, it is confusing because there's lots of different things you can do. Teams is a beast of it's the operating system of work now, right? It's so many different things. So the development extensibility has to be in lots of different places. You've got things like bots, you've got tabs, you've got in-meeting experiences, you've got adaptive cards, you've got all these different places you can go. Just the basic blocks, even if you don't actually do any development, I think it's important to know what's possible and what isn't. And if you've got that basic understanding of here are the extensibility points, so this is technically possible, even though I don't really know how to do it, I'd have to go and find a developer or a partner or somebody to do it. Knowing what's possible, but also what's not possible, I think helps you understand where to go, where you could solve problems and where you can't. And so I think that would be like the kind of first place on the pro side. And also, I'd say for IT pros to understand probably in a bit more detail, actually, that same question on the low code side of things, because like it or not, those people are probably going to be where your business goes to have when they have questions about some of this low code stuff, or they get stuck. And so I don't think you can just ignore it or say, well, we don't do that here, because they're going to go and do it anyway, and they are already doing it anyway. So an understanding of that. And if you've got both, then there's a chapter in the book all around fusion development, which I think is really interesting and worth going into. But like, that's the two, but the pro and the low kind of working together and getting the best of both. And that can be really, really kind of really good for making sort of progress.
So are you seeing a lot of low code development, people in the business who've got a day job, and then they're finding the time amongst other things to get into this then?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's coming from all over the business. And it tends to be people who are not in development in IT, and they're not necessarily particularly technical, but they're good people, they're smart people, they know their business really well. And much more than any IT department, they know the sticky parts of the business. They know the bits that are taking all the time, that probably could be automated, and that would make the business a lot more effective and efficient if they could just be automated away, or some process put in place. So they're the ideal people to do this stuff. They are the right people to do this stuff. If you can get over this, fear is probably the wrong word. It's just they don't even know it's possible, or they've got an idea it's possible, because Microsoft obviously are telling, are sending out this message that it is possible. Anybody could do these things. And so it's understanding that and like channeling it into, you can do this, and this is how, and then helping them when they get stuck. Because again, coming back to the Fusion Dev thing, like developers and the development teams in organizations, they know an awful lot about how to run projects well and how to make good software in terms of things like versioning and support and maintenance and security and all these things that IT managers are worried about random people in the organization throwing together business critical applications and just putting them out there with no thought as to like who looks after them after that person leaves the organization, or whether or not there's a security risk there or whatever. Those are genuine problems that need to be solved, but I think they're solved by those teams working together, not by just kind of saying no.
Yeah, that's a really good point, because one of the things that I've historically seen in previous low-code efforts, right? If you go back to the bad old days of Lotus Domino, for example, or Visual Fox Pro, or even Visual Basic when it was first introduced, the promise has always been you can take somebody who's a business expert and give them just sort of a little light coating of developer knowledge in a tool and let them do something to help advance the business. So it's a really powerful proposition, but the way that has worked out in some of this previous waves, people have built these solutions that are sort of, in my family, we call it Cajun engineering. They're just sort of barely stuck together. They don't have a lot of error handling. They don't have a lot of security or safety or redundancy. And eventually, if they're successful, if the solution that these non-developers build solve a business problem, they get integrated into the business flow, and then sometimes IT has handed them and said, here is something that is built out of bubble gum and fence wire, and you need to support it because it's important to the business.
And that might be Excel or Access, as well as
that's a good point too, Steve. A lot of this has happened in the context of Excel, with Excel macros and these sort of fantastic sugar castles you can build on top of Excel.
Yeah. And whereas there are, if you involved everybody from the beginning, there are good ways to solve that problem. There are good demarcs where IT can take some of maybe the business logic part, the really complicated part, wrap it up into a Power App connector maybe, and then have the business use and build the bots and the flows and everything else that they need, taking that same functionality. Like, it doesn't have to be one or the other; it can totally be both.
So, Paul, you've got a background, well, partly as a developer. You've run product teams as well. So it's almost a question for both of you, really, because Paul obviously, comes from an IT pro side as well, as we all know, from what you write about Teams Voice, or teaching people about all sorts of things. And of course, Tom, you've been speaking to rooms full of IT pros for at least the last 3, 4, 5 years. So I can imagine you both ask this question. What makes you a developer? If you're an IT pro and you start down this route as you're doing a bit of PowerShell, you're doing a bit of Graph API, is there a point where you need to know more, or is there a point where you can put it down on your CV? I'm a developer. I'm a programmer. Where's the gap and divide really as you go down that route as an IT pro?
Paul, do you want to
That's
go
an
first?
interesting question.
Yeah.
Yes, I'll take a swing at that. What I used to tell people when I first started running, there comes this point at which people who run casually start to flip their mental switches and start to think of themselves as runners. And I think the same thing is true for runners as it is for developers. A developer is somebody who develops, right? So the minute you sit down and take a notepad and put 3 PowerShell commandlets in a row and save it as a script and then run it, you've just developed something. Now, I think, Tom, your point about siloing from earlier is really good because we have a lot of accumulated cultural baggage. It makes people think that developers do certain things, behave in certain ways, have certain thought patterns. And it's true that I would expect somebody who is a professional developer to be more concerned with things like security impact, or making sure that a tool that's used by by an organization that's subject to GDPR is doing data minimization and so on. Right. So I would expect somebody who makes a living from these things to be more concerned with a lot of these finer points. But as far as I'm concerned, anybody who builds a solution for themselves or other people to use using any of these tools counts as a developer.
Yeah, no, 100% agree. I used to do this thing where I would ask a room full of IT pros, like, anyone here is developer, and you'd get like literally one hand. If you're lucky, it's like, okay, fine. Who does PowerShell scripts? And like 60% of the room would go up. It's like, you're all developers. You just don't realize it, right? You don't think you are. And it's, it doesn't have to. You don't have to be. Development is lots of different things. Yeah, all the way up to professional level development. But for an awful lot of people, development is a tool, not a profession. You don't need to become a professional developer, go study and leave your job and become a developer before you can jump into some of these things. You can dip in and out of it as long as you're aware at a sort of vague sense what you're doing, but also more importantly what you're not doing, and it might be fine. Like if you're doing something for yourself and you're not too worried about version control or where the data lives and anything like that, you don't need to worry about any of that stuff. But just knowing it's there, and knowing that it's a problem that has already been solved that you don't need to try and solve. There are, it's like anything, isn't it? Like the more you get into it, you understand the limitations of what you already know. But yeah, it's there's no reason. There shouldn't be any barriers to entry, I don't think, because you can go all the way down to just completely no code solutions now, and still, I think, develop something. If you're putting together a flow in Power Automate, you're developing a flow. You are a developer of, the tooling is more abstract than it was 20 years ago, but you're still developing.
So I was going to ask, as the sort of last question, where do you find inspiration for projects? But I found some from you. So I remember you several years ago now, actually. You wrote something about making your Philips Hue lights into a busy light, right? Was it for Skype for Business?
Yes, it was.
So
Yep.
I thought, well, I'll try and do some Python coding with the Graph API to make.
Nice.
It's not finished. I've not done. It's on a breadboard at the moment, but it's a multicolor LED that I can control with Python via an API. And I thought I'll use a Python API with a Graph API. So I'd be a developer, not a professional one, but.
Perfect. You're solving your own problem. It's perfect.
Yes, that's exactly it.
But I'm copying you for inspiration. Where would you find your inspiration for doing stuff? To learn, a bit like the old days of getting a coding type in, if you're as old as me, and typing in some code, and then you learnt it as you sort of went along. Yeah,
the more it's one of those things. I see it now I spend a lot of time talking to customers in organizations, and you sort of see the pain points, right? But even if you just look at your own kind of workflow of your day, there's things you do that are probably not ideal. You copy something from here to here every 3 weeks because it needs to be in this weird format for HR or whatever, and that's the thing you do, and you do it religiously every 3 weeks. Could you automate that? Could it maybe, there's functionality in Graph to go and build Excel or Word files or whatever programmatically? Maybe you could look into doing that. and it would save you a little bit of time, but also you'd learn a lot. So there's things like that. I actually find that the Microsoft Teams app templates are a really good thing to go and browse, because there are just a big collection of open source, freely available solutions to real world problems, written by Microsoft and the community. They're really well architected. They come with really good documentation. They're a really good learning tool as well, actually, for just understanding how to build some of this stuff. But they're a good inspiration as well. Like, here are some different problems people have solved. Here's like a find an expert bot. Here's a company communicator tool. Here's something for people going back to offices where, office managers need to understand how many people are in the building at the moment. Things like that. There's lots. And then just kind of in the environment, the more you do it, the more you kind of pick up on ideas, and you sort of see things and think, actually, that would be a good idea for an app and stuff like that. Yeah.
Cool. All right. Well, thank you for joining us on the show today. It has been a pleasure, as always. And we'll put a link to your new book below the podcast and on the YouTube channel today. Thank you very much.
Cool. Thanks very much.
Yep. Thanks, Tom.